be hard-pushed to find someone who doesn't know all the words to Wonderwall or who has never heard Blur's song too, showing just how large an impact Britpop had on society. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the Britpop movement and we'll be discussing the aesthetics associated with it. From parkas and bucket hats to anything made by Fila or Kappa, the uniform of the Britpop fan still remains strong to this day. The popularity of the music, the style, and the key bands within the movement is still immense, so let's take a look at just what is so appealing about it. Let's start by defining Britpop. Britpop was a 1990s British music and culture movement that focused on independent bands that specialised in alternative rock music. Some of the heavy hitters within the movement were Oasis, Blur, Pulp and Suede, with each of these bands making a notable mark on British music history. They often drew inspiration from other successful British bands that had gone before them, including the Beatles, the Kinks, the Smiths, the Stone Roses, Pink Floyd and In Spiral Carpets, with these bands and the Britpop movement all heralding British culture. Britpop was seen to be countering American grunge, with Damon Albarn of Blur saying that, if punk was about getting rid of hippies, then I'm getting rid of grunge. They believed that grunge said nothing about their own lives, with Britpop bands preferring to write songs that were relatable for British youths, often playing up their regional accents as part of their identity. In 1995, Blur and Oasis competed for the #1 chart spot in what became known as the Battle of Britpop, and much of this rivalry was dependent on the difference in class and region between the bands. Oasis was seen to represent the working class northern quotient of Britain, whereas Blur represented the southerners. The North versus South divide was intrinsic to the Britpop movement, with fans invariably picking a side. This pride in being British that was key to the movement influenced the aesthetics associated with it. So let's move on to the image of the Britpop bands and fans. As could be expected, the Union Jack was a prominent symbol within the Britpop movement, as it had been for the British invasion of the 1960s and the Manchester movement in the late 1980s. However, Britishness was celebrated in a different way to the overt patriotism of the Americans. Much like with the bands of the 1980s, Britpop bands were not afraid to criticise British society and lifestyles, painting a realistic image of what it was like to be from there, whilst also revelling in the pride of being representative of their nation. This attitude towards Britain and life in general was reflected in their styling, which was subsequently copied by their fans. The fashion was very casual, reviving certain mod styles and adding a football hooligan twist to it. Britpop became intrinsically linked to lad culture, which was centred around drinking, watching football, starting fights and having sex, or at least looking as though these were your pastimes. Of course, there were variations between the key bands in terms of style, but this laddish appearance was the overriding image that was common to their fans, including the girls. Popular brands amongst the Britpop stars and their fans included sports brands such as Fila, Adidas, Kappa and Reebok, as well as slightly more upmarket brands including Fred Perry, Burberry, Stone Island and Lacoste. Smart casual met sportswear in the Britpop wardrobe, as those within the movement wanted to look simultaneously put together, but effortless. Britpop fan Chris Black is quoted in an article on high snobiety, saying, "The reality is, it's less about the garment and more about how they're wearing it, or the swag they're wearing it with." They were able to take these working class, pretty simple garments and give them this incredible amount of swagger and appeal to a young person. And really, this sums up the whole movement. Britpop bands became spokespeople for the youth of Britain, so how they presented themselves mattered. The attitudes of frontmen such as Jarvis Cocker, Damon Albarn and Liam Gallagher were seen as cocky, entertaining, inherently masculine and very British. These laddish personas are still viewed as something to want to emulate by British youths, which is in part why Britpop style is still so popular. Nostalgia constantly influences fashion trends, and donning a parka, a bucket hat, and a Stone Island top allows fans to embody the carefree, laddish vibe of the Britpop stars. Casual fashion had already been dominant in the 90s, largely due to the popularity of grunge, but Britpop style was less scruffy as a general rule. Though many of the popular brands worn by fans were from other nations, the way that these looks were put together and the attitude that they were worn with screamed Britishness. There was also an emphasis on the common, everyday people being able to be part of this movement, as the musicians themselves were from the same stock. Many of the items that were popular, despite being sold for ridiculously high prices nowadays, were actually pretty affordable for most fans. You could look the parts with lower-end sportswear just as well as those who looked the parts in Fred Perry and Burberry, showing an inclusiveness for the working-class Brits. There was a real departure from the groomed, bold styles of the decades prior, such as the New Romantics movement of the 1980s or the glam rock style of the 1970s, with comfort, accessibility, and masculinity being favoured. Of course, there were members of the movement who dressed slightly differently, such as Brett Anderson, the frontman from Suede, who donned a more androgynous, sleek look. But, by and large, laddishness was the key vibe to emulate. The movement is still incredibly popular to this day, and it's easy to see why. With bands that wrote catchy songs that depicted the reality of British life, whilst carrying themselves with a confidence and attitude that is magnetic, it's not surprising that they are still held in such high regard today. Just as they spoke for the youths in the 90s, their music and image still makes British youths feel represented in the present, so it's no wonder that 90s trends that Britpop popularised are still found in shops everywhere. I'd love to know who your favourite Britpop band is and which of these trends you are a fan of. If you made it to this point, thank you so much, and I'd love it if you could like and subscribe. Thanks for watching!